Mixed emotions for the Magadla family on this difficult day. Let's speak to clinical psychologist Bradley Daniels about the counselling they may need. Bradley, thank you so much for your time this evening. So it's been 3 weeks of trauma for not only this family, but the broader community who've really been there daily to support them, praying for his safe return. And eventually, when days continue to pass, the family could only hope that his body may be retrieved so that they could at least find some sense of closure. After these very, very difficult 3 weeks for the family, what kind of counselling should they be getting, and what kind of emotions are the community experiencing at this stage?
Good evening, Anli, and thank you for having me on the show. So fundamentally, I think, firstly, it is an absolute trauma that the Magadla family must be experiencing at the loss of their child, who's been unfound for close to a month now, as far as the tally goes. So I can imagine that the emotions are definitely going to be a mixed bag of emotions. So it will be, in some ways, the elation of having found the physical body, but in many ways it will also be the disturbing, distraught grief at the loss of a child. I think it is the most abnormal type of loss for any parent to lose a child. And as you also said, I think it doesn't only affect the Magadla family, it also affects an entire community. And I think as we understand that, this was yet another life of a child that was sort of lost in a senseless manner, which seems to be due to negligence in terms of service delivery possibly not happening, or the manhole not being closed. So this is definitely going to be a very difficult moment for the Magadla family. And I think, firstly, we have to start off by sending our condolences and the biggest sort of strength for this family at this particular point in time. So in terms of counselling, it will not be a very straightforward that, counselling in sort of 1, 2, 3 sessions is going to absolutely take this hurt and this grief away. It really is going to be a process. And this process has already unfolded from the very moment that Khayalethu had disappeared. So that's already when the emotions started becoming quite anxious, I imagine, not knowing whether, their child is alive or not. And, going through the search and rescue process must have been daunting for the entire family emotionally as well. So at this stage now, I think, as you said in the intro earlier, so the possibility of finding a body gives them a chance to closure, but it's not the end of the road for this family, and certainly for the community as well. I'm sure there will be many feelings of anger around as well, anger as to why this particular incident took place. It will also be followed by some sadness, definite sadness as well. And then there will also be quite a difficult road of coming to some sort of negotiation and acceptance around this tragic loss. So it definitely is going to be quite a long path for this family, and they may require as much support as is possible to them.
Bradley, that kind of formal counselling support is not often available to families or communities living sort of in the kind of conditions that we find in the poorer sectors of South Africa. And often the children are hardest hit by that. And we know that while the EMS services have been very supportive of this family and helped them through the difficult days when the search was ongoing, that in itself is not enough. And I'm sure children in these communities, and specifically in this community, must be very fearful of the same kind of thing happening to them. So how do the community members talk to their children about what's happened to Khaya, and to just set them at ease and try and help them to process the loss perhaps of a friend, of a neighbour, of someone they might went to school with?
And I think, listening to that question, we have to start at the point where children have a right to be held safely by the adults that, or by society. It is the part of the every child's right to be safe. And, as a government, we really have to fulfill that mandate to keep all children safe. So, for example, in this particular incident, that safe environment was not there, and this is why this tragic loss of Khayalethu's life actually took place. So that's actually where we have to start. We have to start with regards to looking at how we provide safe or unsafe environments for our children. And that often starts with the infrastructure. I mean, the story sounds very similar to me as some of the several stories around children falling down pitcher trees. In the first place, the pitcher trees should not have been there. The manhole should not have been open. So in that case, we really have to start at that point. And so obviously, I think the strategy for parents and community members at this particular point in time would probably have to start with regards to, taking some sort of responsibility in terms of ensuring that the service delivery happens so that the environment itself starts off by being safe. So that for example, things like manholes are closed, and then we also have to perhaps do some type of education with children. I mean, I know for sure that, children particularly in township areas don't have access to formal parks. So often they're playing next to places that are unsafe. So the community, including the school, the parents, and sort of the larger community leaders, would have to perhaps think of having some sort of safety psychoeducation for the kids, which would also serve the purpose of perhaps helping with perhaps the tragic shock that some of the kids may be experiencing, especially those that perhaps know or knew Khayalethu as somebody who went to their school. But I think it's not a wise idea to be try and create safety for children by instilling fear within them. So it's really around having the conversation around how do we ensure that we keep our children safe, and how do we also make sure that we empower our children to know which areas in the community are safe and which ones are unsafe. So I think that's probably a more balanced strategy to use at this particular point in time.
Bradley, my last question for you. This has also been a high-profile tragedy in the sense that it's received media coverage almost daily since Khayalethu fell into that manhole 3 weeks ago. So not only has the family had to process their own personal trauma as a family unit, but they've been reminded of it daily. And now they're being reminded of his death, very real, though it must feel to them every time they look at the television. So how do they process that, and how do they deal with media interviews during this difficult time?
I think it's always important, particularly for the media, to be very mindful with regards to getting the story versus respecting the psychological environment. And so often when we deal with tragedy or grief, we find that, the family will often say that, they would want to have some privacy to sort of work through some of the emotions. However, I noticed that often happens where there is often more affluence. Because if you look at even the Nathaniel Julius case that happened as well, families that have poorer access often don't have the ability to say that they would like some space to sort of grieve the process. They often get quite a lot of media attention, which is obviously what has been happening over the last 20 days, both with the intention of helping to find Khayalethu's body. But I think at this stage, it is really going to be important to be very mindful about how the story is uncovered at this particular point in time. And I think also to use a more form of social justice type approach in terms of ensuring that some sort of justice is sort of achieved for this particular family, and that they also are getting the right support. And I know that usually what tends to happen in cases such as these, the government does send social development to support with counselling through social work services. Often there is also monetary sort of compensation that is given. And those things will be supportive, but unfortunately the loss of the life of Khayalethu is almost never going to be able to be made up for, or to be able to be made good on. So really the long and the short is that the Magadla family will really have a long process to make sense of this particular loss and this particular grief and tragedy that has happened at this particular point in time. And I think it's really important to also note that grief is not something which happens in isolation. Grief is cumulative. And if you think about the state of grief in which we have lived in the world over the last 2 years already with COVID-19 and the pandemic, this is yet another sense of loss that this particular family is going to have to make sense of and process. So it really is going to be a long and challenging road ahead for this particular family.
Thank you so much, clinical psychologist Bradley Daniels, giving us some insights into what the Magadla family is going through at the moment.